Hey, welcome to another Ever Weird Downtime. The downtime is the downtime between me playing sessions of the Gunderholfen saga, where I am solo playing this Gunderholfen megadungeon using the Basic D&D rules from the 1980s and 90s. In other words, it is old school D&D play. I'm not doing this because I am nostalgic for that. I missed out on that era of D&D. But hopefully this video gives you a little bit more idea of like what is keeping me interested in this hobby and keeping me interested in pursuing old school play, because I want to talk about emergent narrative in old school D&D. So to catch you up on things in the Gunderholfen saga, I have a party that's been venturing in here into this mega dungeon. When they need to refresh, resupply, just heal up, they return to Longfelt City, which is all detailed in this awesome book of Gunderholfen. On their last venture out, they'd sort of conquered the first level of this dungeon entirely, and they were headed out to go down to level 2, take the spiral staircase down there. They'd loaded for bear, and they headed out, and I had a random encounter in the swamp on the way to the dungeon, and one of my company perished. So I had a little think about it, and how is this going to affect the dynamics of the party? They've lost a lot of people, and one of the characters I wanted to kind of change their arc, and this seemed like this is the opportunity to do it. So that character, who was one of the founders of the party, left, and the party doesn't know when they may return, and this has kind of torn up the other founder of the party. She's very distraught that her friend is gone and doesn't want to venture back to Gunderholfen until they return. So I've been running side quests. So far, I've just run side quests out of the Old School Essentials adventure anthologies. I've run The Jeweler's Sanctum, The Curse of the Maggot God from Anthology 1, and Barrow of the Bone Blackguards from Anthology 2. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in my story, because none of this was planned out. This is all coming up through the play that I am doing as a solo player. So when this character Virago left the party, not knowing what to do, the party had received like a hook, an offer to go to the Jeweler's Sanctum and help clear out this mansion that a person had inherited it from their jeweler magician grandfather, and there were strange noises and strange happenings in the cellar of this place. So my party was hired, not really hired, just offered like whatever you find you can keep, to go through and clear out all the noises, investigate what's going on. They did that. It was one session that I played, session 13, but I split it into 2 different episodes on YouTube and in my podcast. Nonetheless, they did that and they were successful. But when they came back, one of the consequences was one of the characters had been poisoned for 10 days. So the others, without that character, this is a terrible map, but this is the Curse of the Maggot God. So in session 14, they go into the Curse of the Maggot God, which is the Guild of Sewer People gives them this job to go find out what happened to one of their workers who's disappeared. They're following these sort of drag marks around. They encounter some stuff that they can't deal with. It's a cleric who has this wand of fetid curses, and he hits 3 of them with this wand. They get these terrible sores and boils all over them, and it reduces their 2 hit rolls and their saves. At that point, they had no choice but to run out of here. They'd already kind of retreated at one point during a battle and decided to go back in. But when this cleric shows up and starts hitting them all with the fetid curses, they just run. Then I decided back in Longfelt that these characters are not going to return to that area for the Curse of the Maggot God. Put a pin in that, because that's what I'm going to come back to. And we did the Barrow of the Bone Blackguards. I had previously taken a group through this. Not completely. That group is still in here. But I took a different route in and was able to discover stuff that I didn't know as a DM, because I hadn't read that adventure fully. I usually go into these things with minimal prep so that I can be surprised along with the players. And certainly as a solo player, that's what I do. So they get out of that, and some things happened outside of this that are going to switch up the story as well. I preface this video with all of that to talk about this emergent narrative in old school D&D. I've covered what's happening in my Gunderholfen saga. This character named Virago has left the party for vague reasons, just wants to return to their home in the mountains and their clan of barbarians and sort of reset after the last death of another party member. So my characters have chosen to do side quests. These 2 things, having a character leave the party, whether that's one of your players or something in the, maybe your player says, hey, I don't want this character to go on these adventures anymore. Can I roll up a new character and come in? Every little choice like that provides an opportunity for narrative growth. Choosing to go on side quests and deciding to do a side quest and not go back to the main dungeon, that's another opportunity for narrative growth. Anytime a character dies or disappears, narrative growth. So all of this is like leading to this narrative growth, all of these choices. Yes, that happens in other RPGs. Yes, that happens in modern D&D. But I think there's some special things about old school play that enable this and help you run a more organic game where this stuff can emerge naturally and you're not sort of forcing it on them. Part of that is that there's a play loop in old school gaming, in RPGs. And it doesn't always have to be like this, but there's a kind of accepted trope where you have a home base or you have a city like Longfelt and Gunderholfen that you can return to resupply, refresh, heal, and then you go to the adventure location, have an adventure, and you go back to the home base. You sort of repeat this play loop. But you can always interrupt that. You can have an adventure in between those two things. You can also go from the home base and choose to do a side quest, and you can branch out like that. So you're not stuck in this railroad of like, we have to finish this mega dungeon. In fact, if I had players who were in a mega dungeon and were just having a miserable experience and came back to Longfelt and said, hey, we don't want to do that, but we're not going back to that mega dungeon. Great. That not only gives me opportunities to change things in that dungeon, maybe those creatures start getting out and impacting the city in different ways. There's going to be things that come up from that. Like I can make that live in a story that's coming up because of a choice they made. Not that you can't do that in other RPGs or in modern D&D, but I think this play loop that's baked into old school play helps that come up. I want to say that this narrative growth, this idea, like anytime you run into one of these things that changes the dynamics of the party, the responsibility for that narrative growth should be on the players. They should decide in those moments to change something in the way the story's going. Additionally, when they decide not to complete a side quest, as my players did, my players got in here and they were so badly hurt, they said, we're not going back there. I want players in my games at the table to do that as well. That's not just a thing of solo play. I feel like it came up really naturally for me as I was soloing, was thinking like, what is the logical step here? Do I go back? They had searched for this secret entrance and never found it. They knew there's only one way in. They can make a couple of different choices of different hallways to go in, but they know that there's this threat in here that poisoned them so badly, like cursed them so badly. Why would they go back? So I sort of naturally made the choice. They're not going back there until they level up. And when they do that, I will change some things in the dungeon to accommodate for that. That choice that I made as a player and that I want my players to make, not to do something and to do something else instead, that like empowers them in this game and, leads to narrative growth, which then puts something on the players to explain how their character grows. We do that in different old school games through like scars or long-term injuries or things like that can impact a character, but it can also just come naturally in the way that it happened with Virago, of me realizing like, I don't think Virago wants to be in this party as it is composed right now. Things will be revealed. Like I have an idea that's happening with that character behind the scenes. That's my responsibility. That is not the dungeon masters. Of course, these roles are blurred in solo play, but one thing I see in dungeon masters who are specifically running modern games like D&D, like modern 5th edition D&D, is that they feel like whenever something like this branches out, it is then the session ends and the DM has to go away and come up with a story that explains all of this. I throw that out the window. That is not the DM's responsibility. If your players choose to do something else, that reasoning and everything should be on them, and they should explain how their character grows positively or negatively because of that choice that they've made. I drew a little map here to illustrate sort of how I think of modern D&D campaigns. And I know there's opportunity for this like emergent narrative in those games. Like I'm not trying to yuck anybody's yum here. I just want to advocate for this old school version of play where it's much more about the exploration and the adventure into the dungeons, into the dangerous place, and what comes out of that. Whereas in modern D&D, we're meeting in a tavern. I know that doesn't always happen, but we often set out knowing that there's a big bad, or learning along the way that there's a big bad at the end of this, and then there's a road. However windy it is, it leads to the big bad. So your players know all along these things that we do or don't do, it doesn't matter. They loop us back onto that main road. We're headed to the big bad no matter what we do. I am doing this in my last 5th edition campaign. I'm totally guilty of this. This is exactly how I've run it. There's a little side quest that they can take or not take, but they loop out and they loop back onto the main road. Sometimes those side quests give them information that leads them to better prepare for the big bad at the end, but they're still pointed in that direction. Whereas in old school play, like in Gunderholfen, if my players decide not to go back to Gunderholfen, fine. I will just grab another adventure and we will go in that direction. I have told my old school players that in modern D&D, this is how I've explained it to them. In modern D&D, the story is like what happens to those original characters that you've come up with at the beginning of the adventure. The story is what happens to them along the way to this end. But in our old school game, the story is what we as players experience as we take different characters through these different adventures. We're not in a book that has a conclusion pre-written to it. And certainly it can feel like the trick with modern D&D, and I can't speak for games like Pathfinder, Starfinder, but those things where you're in an adventure path that leads somewhere. The trick with those things is trying to make it so there is tension. Like, how are we still headed in this direction and making our own choices? That becomes a really difficult thing for a game master to manage. And I don't have to manage that in old school play because there isn't a predetermined end or even like a big battle or a big baddie. You know, there are things that I'm going to come up with along the way within the loops that are going to change aspects of, say, the Gunderholfen megadungeon or the city that they're in or just the environment around them. But I'm not leading them to one thing or hoping that they don't derail my campaign. There's so much concern in Reddit subreddits that I follow about DM advice where new DMs or even experienced DMs are saying like, well, like I feel like my characters have to have plot armor because I want them to get to this stage. I have felt this too in 5th edition. And it becomes a cognitive burden for the DM to try to thread this needle of providing tension within a game, but still pointing them at the end goal. And I don't have that in old school D&D. And that's why I'm playing old school D&D. That is why I'm playing it solo. That's why I'm running more games in it. That's my preferred play style is like, let's all sit down, let me do minimal prep and let's see where this goes. So I hope that comes off as overly like a positive review of old school gaming and not a negative review of 5th edition gaming, but certainly like my preferences are known. And I just hope you'll pick up some old school games and give them a try and see if that scratches that itch that you want to experience in Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games, you know, whether that is the official D&D or some other kind of spinoff. I think that this is very appealing to most players of that kind of game. And I feel like I want there to be growth in that space so that we can all tell more interesting stories together with our friends.